The sun, a distant promise or an unwelcome intruder, refused to penetrate the deepest recesses of the aging, creaking stable. It was a place where light perpetually surrendered to shadow, and the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with the scent of old wood, damp straw, and a constant underlying tension that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building. In that suffocating gloom, relegated to the furthest, darkest corner, stood the warhorse known simply as Grom. He was a creature forged in the crucible of battle, his immense frame and powerful musculature hinting at the ferocious magnificence he once commanded on the battlefield. Now, however, that strength was irrevocably corrupted, channeled entirely into a desperate, furious defense. The relentless exposure to violence and the inevitable, crushing betrayal that followed abandonment had calcified his noble heart, hardening it into a protective, unyielding stone. Grom knew no gentleness. The only language he retained was the uncompromising lexicon of force. His enclosure, stall number 13, was not merely a pen but a fortress, a high-walled cell where the thick, scarred wooden boards had been repeatedly reinforced. This was a structure built not only to contain him, but more tragically, to partition him definitively from the world, a necessary barrier against the uncontrollable chaos that now resided within his spirit. A palpable, viscous silence perpetually clung to this secluded corner of the barn, an unnatural stillness that muffled the typical sounds of stable life, a terrifying testament to the sheer depth of the fear he instilled in every living creature nearby. The boundary of this terror was strictly and instinctively maintained. No groom or stable hand dared to trespass the invisible 5-meter perimeter. Any approach, no matter how cautious, measured, or well-intentioned, was instantly met with a furious, unbridled response. A deep, guttural neigh erupted from his chest, a sound that promised annihilation. Rumbling through the structure like a sudden mountain avalanche. This terrifying vocalization was immediately followed by the echoing, deafening thunder of a striking hoof, a blow possessing enough raw, destructive kinetic energy to easily splinter the heavy timber of his prison and crush bone beneath its impact. Grom stood perpetually tense, an undeniable exile, a magnificent but profoundly tragic figure. He was a living, breathing, terrifying statue of his own agonizing, persistent, and unyielding pain. His eyes, wild and impossibly dark, were not merely looking out at the oppressive surroundings. They were two profound, empty hollows, two twin abysses where the primal, corrosive fear of ever being wounded or betrayed again had permanently taken root. Extinguishing all possibility of warmth or peace, he was a monument to what had been lost. The suffocating silence that perpetually enveloped the 13th stall was abruptly yet subtly fractured. Into the cavernous space of the aging stable stepped Lena. She was 19 years old, her fragile appearance belied by a profound stillness. In her slender hands, she carried a cracked, silent violin, a broken echo of the music that once defined her. A recent brutal accident had stolen her voice, and in a crushing symmetry, the trauma had simultaneously paralyzed her ability to perform. She moved with an ethereal grace, almost soundlessly gliding across the packed earth floor, appearing less like a visitor and more like the wraith of her own shattered spirit. Her eyes, however, held a weary depth that transcended her youth. In their gaze, one could discern the same profound exhaustion and shared sense of helplessness that haunted the dark eyes of Grom. It was this unseen bond that seemed to guide her steps, drawing her past the crowded stalls and the curious glances of the other animals, directly toward the shadow-draped fortress of stall 13. There was no trace of the nervous apprehension or paralyzing fear that gripped the stable hands. Her eyes were utterly devoid of it. Instead, they radiated a quiet, unshakable resolve, a steely inner certainty that often belongs only to those who have already endured the worst life had to offer and found nothing left to lose. Grooms and stable hands, recognizing the sheer danger of her path, frantically made desperate, silent gestures, attempting to halt her approach. They pointed toward the warning signs and frantically shook their heads, but Lena simply offered a slight, resolute shake of her own head in return. She continued her slow, deliberate movement until she stood directly before the heavy, scarred timber door of the feared stall. Her gaze, guided by that internal magnetic force, passed effortlessly beyond the rough-hewn planks and the straining, powerful musculature of the horse. She looked straight through the surface aggression, focusing her entire being on the profound, deep hollows of the warhorse's eyes. She saw not the fury, but the shared, devastating pain that resided within. An abrupt spike of awareness ripped through the horse. Detecting the unfamiliar presence directly outside his personal perimeter, Grom instantly lunged toward the heavy wooden door of the stall. The air immediately thickened, heavy with pure, undiluted rage, hanging between them like the suffocating atmosphere just before a massive thunderstorm. He snorted violently, a deep, resonant sound, and began to strike the ground repeatedly with his massive hooves, the impacts echoing with destructive power. His enormous body tensed, every muscle bunching and coiling, a terrifying silhouette of potential attack, ready to explode through the barrier. Lena, however, did not flinch, did not retreat, and offered no cry of fear. Instead, she slowly raised the silent instrument in her hands. Grom froze. His momentum and his immediate, furious reaction abruptly dissipated, replaced by a profound, bewildering confusion. The intense fury in his eyes momentarily flickered, as if trying to process this unprecedented, non-threatening challenge. Lena pressed the bow against the cracked strings of the violin. As expected, the result was a miserable, scraping screech, a jarring sound of friction, not music. She then lowered the bow slightly, pulling it away from the strings, and began to move it rhythmically through the empty air. She was playing without sound, enacting a silent, heartbreaking performance. With every graceful, soaring arc of the bow, she transmitted the entirety of her private agony. The melody trapped behind her stolen voice, the music locked within the broken body of the violin, the inescapable, devastating sensation that both her body and soul were fundamentally broken. This was her confession of silence. It was a raw, visual articulation of suffering that required no auditory translation. In the utter, profound quiet of her performance, Grom involuntarily retreated a single step. The intense pressure around his ears eased, and the tightly pinned ears themselves gave a slight, curious twitch. His initial volcanic anger had not vanished, but it had been utterly arrested, held captive by the shared understanding. He stood motionless, his massive form still, listening with a core part of his being that transcended sound. He was listening with his Mauharka to the unspoken lament of another fractured soul. The sheer tension in the air was so immense that it felt like a fragile, overstretched thread, moments away from snapping completely. Lena slowly lowered the violin, its silent presence having served its purpose. Her hand, small, delicate, and profoundly vulnerable, began its agonizingly slow journey. It was not reaching out for a gesture of typical affection, not for the soft muzzle or the thick mane, but instead, it moved directly toward the scarred tissue crisscrossing. Grom's thick neck, the brutal marks left by old, punitive restraints. This was not a reach for comfort. It was a movement of recognition. It was a silent, powerful affirmation from her eyes that seemed to declare, "I know exactly what that feels like." In that single, crystalline moment, Grom, the formidable warhorse who had violently rejected any human touch for months, performed the impossible. He began to lower his massive head. The movement was deliberate, slow, and heavy with years of accumulated resistance. His large, hot forehead eventually rested against the rough timber of the stall door, directly opposite her trembling hand. He did not pull back, did not strike out. Instead, a soft, long expulsion of air escaped his lungs. It was not the threatening growl of aggression that defined his existence, but a long, deep sigh of profound relief. As if a burden carried for a lifetime had finally, momentarily, been set down. The stable hands, who had been frozen in terror while watching from a distance, stood utterly stunned. Several of them instinctively covered their mouths, their eyes welling with unshed tears, unable to comprehend the dismantling of the horse's terror. In that sudden, sacred silence, amidst the heavy wood and the lingering smell of fear, the first fragile ray of unconditional trust was undeniably born. The light outside the stable had long since bled into the deep shadows of evening. The low sun cast long, weary beams through the rafters, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cooling air. The stable owner, a man hardened by years of dealing with broken animals, approached Lena. He saw the stillness of the horse and the girl, but his pragmatism warned him against false hope. He spoke with quiet finality, confirming the danger inherent in the situation. He declared that Grom remained hazardous and insisted that she, a mere girl, had to leave the premises. Lena turned, her face expressionless, and reached for a forgotten piece of chalk near the feed trough. She turned back to the stall's heavy timber and began to scratch her answer onto the scarred wood. Her first line was a condition. She would only depart when Grom himself walked free. Then, with a heavier stroke, she added a profound, powerful declaration. She would not leave him alone in the darkness. Though etched in chalk and entirely silent, her words resonated with the weight of a sacred vow. In that very moment, Grom, who had been quietly resting his weary head near the threshold, lifted it. A low, profound sound escaped him. It was not the familiar, thunderous snort of aggression, but a deep, inquiring sound that bordered on plea. A raw question hanging in the quiet air. Lena understood. The shared language of the wounded transcended speech. She gave a firm, small nod, accepting the covenant forged between them. From that evening forward, her routine became a fixed, vital anchor in the stable's life. She returned daily, settling herself quietly beside the stall door. She spent her hours carefully examining and painstakingly repairing the intricate framework of her broken violin. She did not rush the horse, nor did she press him for further signs of affection. She simply offered the patient, immeasurable gift of time. They sat together, two souls irrevocably shattered by trauma, united by their shared task of painstakingly piecing themselves back together, day by quiet day. A week of silent vigilance and painstaking repair had finally reached its completion. The simple passing of time, marked only by the shifting dust motes and the steady breathing of the horse, had wrought a transformation. It was high noon when Lena Wan secured the final delicate string into place. The violin, once a splintered symbol of loss, was whole again. She slowly lifted the polished wood, resting it gently against her shoulder. Grom, standing in the somber center of his long-held prison, watched her every movement. His enormous head remained utterly still, his dark gaze locked onto her hands with an intensity that transcended mere curiosity. It was anticipation, a deep, silent plea for the music he had only seen. Lena closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and drew the bow across the revitalized instrument. The resulting sound was nothing short of miraculous. The first note was clean, powerful, and resonated like a tolling bell, piercing the oppressive gloom of the stable like a sudden, brilliant ray of sun. This was more than just a melody. It was the return of the Bacchum voice that trauma had stolen from her. The pure, zinging note washed over the stall, a wave of pure emotion. At that precise moment, Gromnyotid moved. Without a word of command, without meeting any resistance from a nervous stable hand, he simply chose his destiny. He took one deliberate step toward the door, then another. The heavy iron hinges of stall 13 let out a protesting squeal as he pushed through the barrier, stepping out of his self-imposed prison for the first time in countless years. His massive body, though trembling slightly, was not shaking with the old tremors of aggression, but with the raw, exhilarating vulnerability of liberation. He did not bolt, nor did he look back at the dark corner. He walked straight to Lena. He slowly lowered his great head, his warm, soft muzzle gently nudging her shoulder. It was a wordless, profound declaration of gratitude and belonging, an unspoken admission that whispered, "Thank you. I am no longer alone." They stood there, the girl, her voice restored through the music, and the horse, his heart unbound by trust, united by the transcendent power of their shared, hard-won peace. They were two broken souls, now whole, having finally found their true, unwavering voice in the profound depth of their silence.